Well, thanks very much to you, Ellie, and to the organizers and to all the colleagues around the circle. This has been super rich and rewarding for me so far, and so I'm happy to bring my small addition to our conversation. So I'm going to talk about an assignment and a book that I have been teaching with or engaging with senior students in international development studies. I'm at mainly a teaching college situated sort of in this interesting institutional relationship between two universities. But I'm not going to go into that. My background is in political studies with area focus, especially in Francophone West Africa. I also want to acknowledge that I am a sixth-generation descendant of settlers on what is now Maine and New Brunswick and Nova Scotia in the east of Turtle Island. That's the unceded traditional territory of the Wolastoqiyik. And I'm coming to you today from Treaty 1 territory in Winnipeg, Manitoba, and the traditional homeland of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and also the Métis Nation. I identify as cis male, heterosexual, white, upper middle class, a Christian, a partner, and a father. So I'm going to talk about this book, Barbara Heron's Desire for Development, Whiteness, Gender, and the Helping Imperative, and sort of a set of assignments that I've used with senior undergraduate and also dual tracked in the same course, a few master's level students as well. I'm going to introduce the text super briefly, then I'm going to talk about the learning goals and activities and the assignments around this text that I use, and then the approach broadly that I've taken, and then point to some opportunities and some challenges with it. So my intention was to read from my notes field, which I have not been able to see in this way of looking at my slides. So I'm at a bit of a loss, I have to be honest. I was just going to read from the publisher's description of this book. And so I'm going to give my best attempt to be flexible. So this is a book that focuses on Heron's interviews with about a dozen white female Canadian development workers in the moment sort of after they've been in the field in sub-Saharan Africa doing development work. And so those conversations, and she also includes herself as a participant. Obviously the interviewees their names are changed with pseudonyms. And then basically she deploys a wide range of theoretical approaches from critical race theory to post-colonial theory, travel writing, and basically develops a critique of the identity or the personhood and the formation, the construction of the identity of white female development workers as bourgeois subjects in the context of their understanding and the relationship to the others who are necessary for the co-construction of their own identity as development workers and as good people, morally good people. And then this Heron refracts through a sort of Canadian settler national narrative of Canadians being kind of good guys, good actors in the global community. So my apologies that that's not as eloquent as the Wilfrid Laurier Press description, but that puts you a little bit in the picture. And maybe there's a lot of people in this circle who, excuse me, know this book already. I took this slide out, but then something that Rachel said yesterday persuaded me to put it back in. This is from the Code Switch podcast on NPR that Shri Marisol Miraji was once the co-host of. And so just this question of how do you create a moral space for yourself inside a story is immoral. Now this particular podcast episode is about the history of racism and of slavery in particular in the United States. And so the story in which white settler descended folks find them embedded is a little different here, but I think this is what comes up in the conversation and engaging with Heron's book, is that the story of, North-South cooperation is a story that, if not immoral, is at least fraught and problematic in a lot of the ways that we've been talking about already today. And so I think partly what Heron's book is about is this struggle that her interlocutors have, and herself as well, with creating a moral space for themselves inside a story that they know to be fraught, and problematic. And so reading this book carefully in the first half, more or less the first 5 or 6 weeks of the course, is an attempt for me to foreground some of these learning objectives and some of these goals in this course, is to just read a whole book carefully. I find sometimes with maybe with undergraduate students more than with graduate students, we ask them to read little snippets of things and never say, hey, here's a 200-page argument, or here's a 300-page argument. Let's engage it. So we do that work together. It's assigned, and then we come together to do it. And then the second piece, and I'll come to the assignment description in a second, but I asked the students to identify companion materials. So materials that students identify that kind of help them get with the Heron book. And I'll talk a little bit more about what that getting with means, or how they kind of approach it. And then also, because of the explicit focus in this book on the identity of a particular category of development practitioners, but because of that focus, that allows us to foreground who development practitioners are, what that narrative, what that story is, but also how different people's story is different, depending on their different backgrounds, whether that's academic or ethno-linguistic or racial or class or gender or what have you. So these are sort of some of the key things that I'm trying to get at with this book and the assignments that I use to present this book. I'll talk a little bit more about the kinds of things, if I have time, and maybe in questions, about the kinds of things that students identify to go along with this book. So basically, these are good discussion posts that I ask students to put up, and they identify a companion source, what I'm calling a companion source, and then they post the reference, and then they post an annotation of it, basically explaining why it is that this source that they've identified helped them engage with some part of the particular chapter or chapters that we were reading that week of Heron's book. And then I ask, and I don't have a way of disciplining students to always do this, but I ask that everyone read at least one other person's annotation. So at least the people in the class are getting familiar with what each other is making of this text and what additional sources people are identifying to kind of scaffold or build around this book. In the past, students have identified quite a range of things. I don't insist on academic sources necessarily. Sometimes students identify book chapters or scholarly articles or blogs or podcasts or TED Talks or whatever. I leave it fairly open. One particularly, I think, rich response was a student pulled out an Instagram account, I think designed by a couple of women from the United States, called Barbie Savior, and it's basically a satirical and critical look at sort of a white savior mentality as refracted sort of through a particular way of using and thinking about social media. So what students identify to be the scaffolding or companion sources, I leave quite open. And then I think that allows students to engage with what's meaningfully kind of helps them, or what's meaningfully connected to Heron. So I try to model engagement with this text, both from my own background, and I talked a little bit about some of my identity markers, but also as a former student, as someone who spent some time right out of undergraduate studies in so-called the field, and I share out of my journal from the mid to late 1990s, and one student this past term described it as cringeworthy. So I felt that there was a kind of good modeling of vulnerability, but also of these being kind of issues that I also have both experienced and continue to struggle with. So I model that kind of engagement from my own position, my own development encounters, and my own ongoing research, so that the problems that Heron identifies, or the questions, are ones that resonate with me. And then I also model engagement with the text in terms of offering suggestions on just sort of more research strategies of, okay, I'm reading this chapter, how do I think about what might be scaffolding, or what might be a good kind of companion source, if my own interests and curiosities don't kind of drive me or lead me to that automatically. Again, I'm trying to decenter my own choices about material where I've chosen the text, but I'm asking the students to build this scaffolding of these companion source. And of course, that means that each time this iteration of this course, we get different stuff, and things kind of go in different directions depending on who's in the class and who's in the room. I get so much out of teaching this course with our most senior students that I've been trying to find ways of building more sharing between peers about the work that they're doing. And so that's where having these as discussion posts. So they're things that both I grade, on a very simple 1 to 4 rubric, which basically if you do it at all, you're already in good shape. And if you do it super well, that's, a 4 to 4 is not unheard of. But really that I want them to be able to engage with each other's work and see each other in the process of navigating and struggling and learning about the Heron text and its strengths and weaknesses. I'll talk about that as I conclude, but this just the really importance of having peer-to-peer exchange. And then all of that kind of pre-class meeting work then feeds into the class discussions where I, validate students' choices. I probe them for more, for them to say more, test it against sort of how that reflects their understanding of Heron. We kind of go, let's go to page 28 and look at what Heron says and really understand why student so-and-so, zeroed in on that and then pick this companion source to amplify that or critique it or get at it in some important way. So I'm going to conclude here with challenges and opportunities. It's a difficult text. It's theoretically rich. I think it really lays bare some moral, the moral fraughtness at the very least of international development cooperation, especially in the sort of north-south, sort of this orthodox north-south dynamic that makes the text potentially, I think, emotionally difficult. And so I think those are challenges to kind of rise to. I think that's also part of the richness of the text. We kind of finish with this text at midterm, and then we kind of shift gears a little bit, and I can talk a little bit about how work with this book does or doesn't impact work later in the course. So I haven't really found a way to kind of get back to Heron, except maybe in the very last week or last class where we sort of do a bit of a wrap up, and then we're reaching back to, remember when we read that other book like 6 or 8 weeks ago? So the book is really about the experience of white, female, sort of cis female Canadian development workers. And so there's certainly, that's not the majority of, it is the majority of the students that I work with, but it's not all the students I work with. And so there are some things that Heron says, especially about when she digs into sort of the colonial and Victorian era kind of moral, the research that's been done about sort of moral character forming, in a particular, European context. So there's obviously some students for whom that's not their history. And so that's some of the challenge, I think, both in terms of, what does that mean for the students, BIPOC students or students who don't identify as either white or female. And so that's sort of an area of challenge. I'm happy to talk about that in our conversation. I hope we'll have time for. And there's probably other challenges that arise or occur to you or that I might be able to talk about. The strengths and weaknesses of this book, I think, are all teachable, and that's one of the reasons why I've stuck with it. I've considered doing something different, but I'm just really persuaded that what it does well is worth learning about, and what it doesn't do well is also worth attending to and critiquing, and trying to build the richness of students, diverse backgrounds into that critique is partly why I've framed these assignments, these companion source assignments, and the scaffolding work. There is some follow-up. Some students do choose another book. So the second half of the course, the students choose their own book to kind of engage with in this very robust way. And sometimes students choose a book that is similar to or really extrapolates from themes and issues that arise in Heron's book. And so that does sometimes happen. It's not an expectation of mine. It's not something I'm trying to insist on. The second half of the course, I want students to pick a book that they want to spend a lot of time with, because I'm asking them to spend a lot of time with it in terms of a book written by, a development thinker, practitioner, a dialogue partner. And so although Heron does influence that, directly and explicitly for some students, that's not the case for most students. And this is, maybe I'll conclude here, because this is a thing that's persuaded me to hold on to this book. BIPOC students of color do see themselves and are do read themselves into sort of the bourgeois subjectivity that Heron's talking about, not with a specific European history, but what it means to grow up, you know, in a relatively wealthy urban family in urban Pakistan, and then also have, you know, development encounters in rural and poorer parts of Pakistan, or a similar kind of story from urban to rural mainland China, or from urban to rural Kenya, for example. So that there is something about the positionality and the privilege of the development worker, even when that development worker is not a white, female, upper middle class Canadian woman, that resonates and is both, I think, you know, instructive and problematic for ways that are teachable and are quite rich. I feel as though I've exhausted my time for what I have to say, but I see there's some chat, and I'm very looking forward to you asking me questions of clarification, amplification, or challenges that you want me to think about. So thank you so much. And I look forward to our conversation.
Great, thank you. We have a few minutes for questions.
Do I acknowledge people, Ellie, or do you want to, or?
Either, go ahead. You can.
Rebecca, I see your hand, yeah?
Hi, thanks. That was really interesting. I was just curious if students had commentary on the visual, the photograph on the cover of the book.
Yeah.
It's a really interesting backstory, and I don't know if you've talked to Barbara about it, but Barbara's a friend and a research partner of mine. So
Yeah.
it wasn't her choice, and this is the interesting thing about
not-
publishing books. Publishers
Yeah.
have their own ideas of what images to use, and then this one actually was better than others, but it's it's an interesting sort of problem.
Yeah, well, as you probably know this book at least as well as my students do, and the opening chapter really starts with sort of problematic representation, right? And so on the one hand, I didn't know that. I often suggest, as we all know, publishers do what they have to do to try and sell a book. But yeah, that students often find a lot of what's powerful about this book is the problem of representation, of the kinds of ways in which organizations, we've talked about this already, fundraising has certain kinds of, imperatives ostensibly, right? And so how to represent, a vulnerable other such that it elicits, kinds of responses. So that question of representation and what's tied up in that certainly resonates with students for sure. And that, as you say, there's sort of this cue right on the cover of the book that's on the one hand, deeply problematic, and yet it strikes me that, maybe outside of circles like this, a pretty ubiquitous kind of image, right? Of the savior, sort of the north-based white savior kind of mode, and the child, right? The small, vulnerable child, black hand, right? That's on the, problematic and yet still, I think, central, maybe more influential outside of circles like this for sure.
Well, we're right at 3:05. So if there are other questions, use the chat function. And thank you for this presentation, John. This is really, I feel like this afternoon has been like a lot of these really concrete strategies, and they fit together really nicely.